It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our speaker for tonight, William Davies. He's has the chair of Palaeoanthropology at the University of Southampton. And his expertise is in revealing the lives of our ancestors, our far distant ancestors who lived on this earth between 40 and 100,000 years ago, from the scant evidence they left behind. And so his title tonight, I think, is a very apt one. Focusing on the Neanderthals, putting flesh on the bones. So he's been looking at the bones and he's going to put flesh on them for you. So, William, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for your patience. I'm going to try, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm going to try and outline to you the different impacts and influences of various things on the social lives of Neanderthals. And I'm very glad that we only went back to 100,000, because Neanderthals go back maybe 400,000, but there's less perhaps to say at the moment about the earliest Neanderthals. So I'm going to concentrate on the later ones. And obviously the one thing we have to bear in mind to begin with is those environments. They're very different from the ones that we live in today. Neanderthals lived for a very long time, and that means they encountered a great deal of environmental and climatic fluctuation. So you'll see Ka come up quite a lot on the slides. That's simply a shorthand for 1,000 years ago. So one possible framework that we might adopt for looking at the social lives of Neanderthals is to think about energy. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Energy in the form of inputs like food, but also in outputs and the energy you expend to do things. And how Neanderthals therefore might map onto resources, what resources might cost them more in terms of energy, and what resources might give them energy. And we're in a mid-latitudinal band, of course, of the globe, so seasonality is an important factor to bear in mind. Those seasonal shifts will have been important in the lives of Neanderthals. How did they map onto them? How did they organize their societies to take advantage of them? Or when those resources disappeared in winter, say, what happened to the social organization? So that fits on to the use of landscapes and ultimately how space is divided up and conceived by Neanderthals. Now that sounds an ambitious thing to say. They're long gone, we can't ask them. But we can perhaps look at various proxy evidence signals to see whether we can get a sense of where they're moving to in the landscape and at what time of year. And finally, there's no society without interactions, not just interpersonal interactions, but also how they interacted with other species. Now this is the acid test. So over 30 years ago, people made predictions based on resource structure for the ultimately for the social structure of different human species, hominin species. And Neanderthals are there on the right-hand side of that model, where they're in fairly unpredictable resourced areas and rather patchy resourced areas. So Neanderthals, according to this model, would have quite small groups with not much structure to them, and that's a response to having to be highly mobile where necessary and map onto those resources. This perhaps is the sort of the archetypal view of Neanderthal society. Nobody interacts at all. They just sit there, presumably waiting for the scenario at the bottom right-hand corner. And we now know that, of course, this is not really the case. yes, Neanderthal societies do seem to be small scale. That's possibly because there aren't that many of them in the landscape. And I suspect that because they're small scale, most people in the networks knew each other. It wasn't a network where people knew friends of friends of friends. These were direct face-to-face contacts. That might mean that they moved shorter distances, or it might mean that the whole group moved from one place to another, and therefore that the whole group itself wasn't really split up that much. So their symbolic systems, if we adopt this model as a working hypothesis, would actually be quite small scale and quite limited. They're not really sending symbolic objects over long distances as we see later on with our own species. So this presents some of the problem in certain rather isolated areas like the Altai Mountains of Siberia. If you're isolated, you are essentially on your own. And unless they found a way of getting outside that bubble, any ideas that they might have, and we have plenty of evidence for Neanderthals having very good ideas, they don't last very long. They don't last beyond the lifetime of the group. So if climate were to change, or if environment were to change, then that would cause some problems. Now, I apologize for this diagram. It's helping me to think about how things map together. So on the left-hand side, we have the social organization, all the things we might want to look at. That could be the composition of the group, the sort of demographic aspects of it, the different numbers of individuals of age and sex. And that can change in seasonal conditions. If the conditions are good and it's a rich array of resources, you tend to find in ethnographic literature that everybody piles in and joins into big, large groups. We call them aggregations. And that would be the fusion aspect. Now, in conditions where, say, winter, there's very little out there, the groups might split up because there's not enough to support many, many mouths. Many people can be useful when you want to process large quantities of resource, but when there isn't a large quantity of resource, they are essentially redundant, and you run the risk of overextending, out-consuming the available resource. And those compositions can map onto the landscape, which individuals are where in the landscape at a given time of year. If you want to sustain a large group, you might want to have lots of stored resource. We'll come back to this right at the end. At the moment, we don't have much evidence for Neanderthal storage. They're not leaving sort of deep freeze type deposits of resource that they can draw on at any time of the year, as far as we know. Maybe because we're looking for the wrong sort of information. And finally, that landscape use, you've got the people, you've got the seasonal conditions, you've got how they're constructing landscapes, including putting little stores perhaps in different parts of the landscape for future use. But that also ultimately comes back to the subsistence strategy, to the economy. Are they specializing in a particular number of species? And if you read the literature, that tends to be the assumption that Neanderthals go for very large game. Things like mammoth, things like reindeer, large bison and wild cattle or oxen. And it's only fairly recently that in the Mediterranean zones we've seen Neanderthals showing evidence for there's not many large animals in those conditions, so they're spreading their risk over a large number of small fauna, quite often very fast-moving fauna. And so all of these different things have implications for energy inputs and outputs, how many moves you make, how much is the cost of moving. If you've got lots of toddlers in the group, you're not going to be able to move very far, very fast. And the conditions in which you're moving. We're walking today on a nice flat surface, it's nice and dry. But if we were going up and down slopes, and those slopes are covered in mud or in snow, that's going to affect your energetic expenditure and how fast and how far you're going to move in a given time. The transport of raw materials. This is heavy stuff to carry around with you. Where do you carry it always with you, or do you leave little pockets, little caches, little stores in the landscape in case of future need? And finally, talking about the division of labour. Division of labour is a key thing really for specialised economies, and that not just specialisation in a species being targeted, but also in the technology you need to get it, and the technology you need to process it. All of these things require, specialised skills. Now this is another map that sort of gets endlessly repeated in the literature, or a version of it. The Neanderthal world from the eastern Atlantic all the way up into the Altai. Of course, this is not the distribution of Neanderthals across the whole of their existence. At some times, they're mostly within Europe, and at other times, they expand. We often think of Neanderthals as always going extinct, but let's give them the credit. They lasted for 300,000 years or more, and they also expanded as well as sometimes contracted. So all the stuff you see to the east, from Kibara and Kafse and Tabun in the Levant, to Shanidar in Iraqi Kurdistan, to Teshik Tash in Kazakhstan, and all the way up into the Altai. All of these things are sort of time and space dependent. And that means that their social systems might be varying over time and over space as they respond to those local conditions. So I'll just start with those conditions. Some of you in the audience may be well familiar with these. These are ice cores records from Greenland. So basically it's giving you a signal of the Atlantic region in the broad sense. The question of how far across Europe this can be transposed is something we had endless arguments about when I was in a project at Cambridge in the early 2000s. And we never quite resolved it to anyone's complete satisfaction, but this is the best we have. And what I want to draw your attention to is the ups and downs of this spike. This is oxygen isotopes in the ice, and the spikes mark warmer conditions and the troughs mark cooler conditions. And you can see that from our current period, the Holocene, to the last glacial maximum, there's a temperature difference over the ice cap of Greenland, at least, of about 20 degrees. Some of the stuff, some of the indications for the last Neanderthals, from 60,000 to 40,000, there's a difference of about 13 degrees. Now the question is, were they really experiencing these rapid shifts of up to 13 degrees? Or was it slightly more ameliorated by other conditions as you go farther to the east? One thing that seems hard to shake from the literature is that Neanderthals are cold adapted. This is done from the same project. We've got a few more dates to add, but nothing really alters this distribution in Europe. When conditions get cold, Neanderthals move south. They don't move up towards the ice, they move south, they move away from the coldest conditions. Which rather suggests that Neanderthals aren't particularly cold adapted. Yes, they can cope with colder conditions than we can, but we shouldn't just assume that they like cold conditions. And that would probably explain why we also find them in the Levant, in what is now Israel and Lebanon and all the way across, because they might prefer arid rather than cold conditions. Now, this hasn't stopped people from trying to use high latitude hunters and fishers like the Inuit to provide sort of upscaled models for what Neanderthals might have got through in terms of energy. So this is just a few examples. daily energy expenditures of up to 5,000 calories a day for women and up to 6,000 calories a day for men. And that's much towards the high end for modern humans. Based on this, they argue that it's going to take about 5 to 6 hours of hunting or foraging a day to collect all those little parcels of energy. And that, according to these models, is up to 1,000 calories an hour more than the daily energy expenditures of each individual. So the more people you've got and you're hunting a larger package, the easier it is to reach your target. Now, energy storage, things like preservation of meat, and that can be done in a variety of ways. You can fillet it and hang it out in the air to dry out. You can extract the fat from it and preserve that, or you can even submerge it under stagnant water. I had a student who tried this once. He didn't eat the meat after he'd kept it in a bowser of water for a month, but apparently once you scrape the black off, it sort of looked flesh-coloured inside. But you have to have a strong stomach, but maybe they did. Now, one of the things that has been recently used in the literature to explain Neanderthal extinction is that Neanderthals were energetically more expensive than we are. So we are the sort of the energy efficient version of the human, and Neanderthals are the four-wheel drive, the SUV of the human world. They consume larger quantities of energy in order to do their daily lives. And people have modelled this again using inferences from ethnographies, from studying current hunter-gatherers today, to work out, and all the time Neanderthals are in energy deficit in comparison to our own species. Is this true? I'll come back to this right at the end. The project I was involved with 25 years ago now, and there's many more different types of simulation now available, this was the first one to do this sort of thing, was to look at environmental conditions for Neanderthals and our early ancestors, modern humans. And it's hard to get your eye in, but you can just about see the Greenwich meridian, second from the left, and that will take you up to Britain if you squint hard enough. And on the western side of the Greenwich meridian is Iberia, and then we have another example between 10 and 20 at the bottom, which is Italy, and then we have the Balkans and the Black Sea. And the blues are really cold winter temperatures, below about -8, up between -8 and -20. And as you'd expect, a lot of that's in sort of the eastern part of the European plain, what is now Russia, but it extends surprisingly far to the west. And that's not factoring in things like wind chill. And for those of you sitting underneath air conditioning, I'm sure you have experience of that. And that project's outputs were used by this publication about 6 years later. They used the averaged annual temperature, and they sort of predicted that Neanderthals found in different parts of their distribution were either tropical, as they put it, or temperate or cold. And it's not great surprise, really, that there's quite a lot of Neanderthals in Western Europe, that little group there. We have a female Neanderthal, also from Western Europe to there. Then we're moving over into the sort of the Balkans area and into in Iraqi Kurdistan with increasing annual temperatures. And then we have those in Levant, which is nice and warm. So as I go back to the point earlier on, if Neanderthals like it cold, why are so many of them on the right-hand side of the graph? and that's the modern humans just for comparison. So annual temperatures are one thing. Let's get down into the seasonality of it all. And seasonality, as I said, can vary. Terrain can vary by how wet it is or how dry it is. That's your pedestrian costs of moving around the landscape. Another cost would be slope angle. How steep is the slope? And some people have argued that Neanderthals have quite short arms and legs, particularly the forearm and the calves, which might make them very good at scrambling around rough terrain, much better than us. So when you talk about energy costs of Neanderthals versus us, you need to factor that in, and nobody has as yet. The nature of the ground, is it firm, is it unstable? Are you having to plough through thick snow without snowshoes? Is it dry, is it waterlogged? How much are you carrying as you're moving this stuff around? You're not just going out to search for food, but you've got to bring it back. You've got to take it back to the camp. And as I talked earlier about laying down stores, raw materials, maybe you place them evenly across the landscape so that you're never too far away from a little stockpile which you can go and use. And do they always take the nice flat routes? Walking along the bottom of a valley might seem to cost you much less energy than scrambling up and down the ridges. But you can also perhaps imagine that all the other predators are going to be taking that least cost route. So if you're carrying a carcass on your back and you come face to face with a cave lion, it might not be particularly energetically advantageous, and you might be better off taking the high cost route in order to get home more safely. So it's not a simple situation. And people have tried modelling this again from the same project. You can see that most of Iberia, down on the bottom, is apparently snow-free, but you have most of Western Europe with some coverage of snow and snow depth, mostly up to about 10 centimetres or so. That doesn't include drifting. And snow duration follows a similar pattern. If you're lucky, you get a month's worth of snow. If you're really unlucky, you get somewhere approaching half a year's worth of snow just sitting there. And that's, depending on where you are, it's going to affect your mobility costs. I'm not arguing this is a much later engraving from Scandinavia, somebody on skis from about 10,000 years ago. But did they have to have something like this to get them around? So far we haven't found it, but maybe it's yet to be found. Now, there have been people who've tried to plot the movement costs of different slope angles. And going down slope really doesn't cost you that many calories in comparison to going up slope. I mean, both have costs, but you can see just how much more significant the uphill costs are. Now, this would have to be ideally done with a computer model of a Neanderthal leg on the similar slopes to see whether that was still the case. These are fairly typical for American male college graduate students on treadmills. They're not necessarily ideal models for Neanderthals. And we can see that often in very dissected, this is a limestone landscape in the southern Rhone, and the rivers to the left will flow into the Rhone itself. But you can see just how topographically varied they are. And all these little green and blue and pink dots are known sources of raw material that are found in that red dot in the middle, site of Baudelaire-Béziers in southern France. And the author, this is Lucy Wilson, calculated, based on the graph I just showed you of graduate students going on treadmills, just the energetic costs of collecting all those resources from those different places and taking them back to the camp. Now, there's two main mobility strategies that are argued for our early ancestors. One is a sort of regular movement of the whole group maybe staying for a few days to a week or two, and often in a big circle over the course of a year. And they call that circulating mobility. Most Neanderthal provisioning strategies seem to fit into what's called radiating mobility. In other words, you have this big hub site which you occupy for at least a season, and everything happens there. And you go out into the surrounding area, and you might have to go quite long distances to bring back key resources and these yellow spots back to the main hub site. And that's quite logistically organized. We tend to think of Neanderthals as just shambling around the landscape, finding whatever they can and taking it there and then. This would imply that Neanderthals are strategically using landscape at different times of the year to collect resources. Because the risk about staying in a place for a long time is that ultimately you exhaust the surrounding area around the site. The longer you stay there, the more you've cleaned out the area in your immediate vicinity, and you have to go farther and farther away until eventually you might as well move the whole camp somewhere else. So they must know how to manage resources and manage population levels in the group in order to make this work. Because several sites, not just in the Levant here, like Kabara and Tabun, but also sites in the area I just showed you in southern France and the Rhone Valley, seem to show this sort of hub-like concentration, going out to satellite areas to collect key resources and bring them back. And that requires organization. Does it require specialization? I'll come on to that. This is based on work that my colleague Alistair Pike did, and it was published in about 2 years ago now, a bit over. And it's from a site called Almonda, the Almonda Karst in Portugal. And the great thing about the top left-hand map is this is a strontium isoscape, different concentrations of strontium in the landscape, is it is actually quite fine-grained. Many other areas don't have this level of detail. And it means that when Alistair takes a Neanderthal tooth and uses laser ablation to burn off a consistent track down the tooth from the crown towards the root, that it gives a sort of day-by-day signal of that Neanderthal's early life. He's mostly using molars, permanent molars, and those tell you something about the first 12 years of somebody's life, as wherever they are, whatever they're eating, whatever they're drinking, will get incorporated into those teeth as they develop. And what this tells us is that Neanderthals are pretty much all over that landscape. They're combing through it on the left-hand side at the bottom, all through the different areas, which might imply that they're using it like a hub. They're using it throughout the year, or much of the year, and they're using it quite intensively. Just as a little comparison, this is a later modern human, and they basically seem to be going from one river to another, not really doing much in between. So it's a different sort of logistical strategy. And this is one of the Neanderthal teeth. You can see that there's each one of these little squares in different colors tells you that Neanderthals moved to a different place. Sometimes they're going to the same place repeatedly, sometimes they're varying the place again and again. So the one on the first three at the top, that's the same place. It's repeated going backwards and forwards between one place and another, then it goes to somewhere else, then it goes somewhere completely different, goes somewhere completely different, somewhere completely different, back to the same place as two lower ones there, and then back to the same place. So it's a sort of, it's not a circular movement, it's a sort of repeated but irregular pattern. Now, there is some specialization. Neanderthals can organize themselves seasonally. We know this from a nice summary paper that came out almost 10 years ago, Neanderthals hunting large animals. And I just take one of these. There's plenty of other maps I could choose, but I'm just going to choose this one, which is site of La Bourte in France. It's about it's somewhere between 100,000 and 72,000 probably. It's what we call marine isotope stage 5. And it uses the local topography of the area, these cliffs and these upland areas, as a sort of trap. So they basically take at least 40 of these wild cattle and they drive them against this cliff. There's not very good bone preservation, so it's hard to see just how they process them afterwards, but simply the number of individuals, and many of them are juveniles and adolescents, would imply that these are sort of nursery herds. Maybe they went for the females and the young because it was slightly less dangerous than tangling with the bulls, although I suspect a cow with calf might have been quite a challenge. And it requires quite a lot of coordination. Cattle move in certain directions. You need a lead cow and then the others will follow. So you have to control them into that sort of rank and file position by pushing them in at the sides and harrying them behind to drive them forwards. So, as White et al. Called them, maybe they were the first cowboys, knowing something about their prey species behaviour and manipulating it. And that would require large numbers of people, and of course it would yield quite a lot of resource. That said, though they had quite a number of mouths to feed, once they'd killed a herd of cattle, they didn't eat everything. They seem, as this quotation said, to be excellent tacticians, casual executioners, and discerning diners. So you just had the fillet steak rather than the whole carcass. So quite wasteful, but maybe this is a social gathering action that draws people together and builds up bonds. In other parts, we're back to the Rhone Valley here. Down at the bottom, we have a sort of wetland environment with large bovids, large cattle type species. We also have some horse and some rhino. And these are more wet and they're more closed, enclosed environments with more vegetation. And right at the top of the plateau are things like deer and bovids again. And on the cliffs are chamois and these sort of mountain goat type species that you are sort of in between one and the other. And that little star in the middle is the cave site. So they're very well positioned for going down below, collecting resource, food, as well as nodules of quartz and quartzite to turn into stone tools. They can also go uphill and onto the plateau and collect deer, more wild cattle, and some flint as well. And there seems to be a sort of change in the balance of these species over time, but the site persists because it's very well placed. So positioning a site in the landscape is a key trick that Neanderthals employ. That said, I just draw your attention to this area around the second circle below, which is a site of Les Pêcheurs, which seems to be quite a specialized site, but the grey to the east of it is the exploited area. If we take the other areas, and these circles represent a circle of influence, maybe 30 to 50 kilometers in radius. There's large areas of white which they're not exploiting. So some rivers, some river valleys don't seem to be exploited by Neanderthals. They seem to be highly focused on resources from certain areas. Other parts of Europe, particularly the sort of limestone areas of Greece and Portugal, this is one down below in Portugal today, are these sort of solution hollows. These are called pollias, where there's a water source, it's nice and enclosed, and you don't have to go very far to get a wide variety of resources, and you've always got permanent water with you. And sometimes in this Portuguese site, they go just a few kilometres down to the coast and get themselves some seafood as well. Seems to be a fairly ideal landscape. They're not moving very far at all. So Neanderthals, going back to that site I just showed you halfway up the cliff, might be wanting to be on the boundaries between one environment and another, because that means that you don't have to move very far to go into one habitat or go into another habitat. You're strategically positioning yourself on the boundaries. So demography. Now, if I were following through the working hypothesis I set out at the beginning, it would be the diagram on the right. These closed societies, small groups only interacting within themselves. And that means that they inbreed as well, because they don't have a large social network. I think much of the evidence now suggests something slightly more relaxed than that in certain parts of Europe, but nothing like what we have on the left-hand side, which is a sort of open society where anyone can interact with anyone else from another group. So Neanderthals probably form some of those, the middle one, the intermediate societies, and the closed groups. And that's important because it tells us about how far information can spread. The farther the distance, the greater the distance you can extend your influence, the more your knowledge can survive, because it spreads into other groups and it survives in them. If it just stays within your own group, it can be at risk of going extinct. All the stuff is, at the sort of the local scale, is about local knowledge, keeping a track of your environment, gossiping, telling stories, oral histories. And the question is, do Neanderthals, if they have a small-scale society, only really operate on the left-hand side of that graph, or do they sometimes extend into the more distant knowledge exchange? Now, we know from the genetics that are coming out that Neanderthal populations were not consistent. On the right-hand side, we have the typical Neanderthals, and this is fairly typical of the whole of Neanderthal existence, a broad range of body forms and characteristics, which is, after about 50,000, really only typical of Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, something happens at about 50,000, and all Neanderthals are replaced by Neanderthals of a very, very particular type. And ironically, it's the type that we hold as the type specimen for Neanderthals. So the Neanderthal Feldhofer there is the original Neanderthal specimen that was discovered in 1856. So the very typical Neanderthals with the big brow ridges and the protruding mid-face and the stocky bodies, those are late, as a late variant of Neanderthals that take over most of Western Europe. And then by 40,000, they're ultimately outbred by modern humans. Now, our problem with reconstructing the demography in Neanderthals is that we don't have many representative samples of a Neanderthal society. This is perhaps one of the best known examples. This is from a cave in northern Spain called El Cedron, where all of the Neanderthals there seem to have been killed by another group. So they all died at the same time. Most of the time we don't have that sudden death assemblage. So there's fairly typical balance. This is something you see in modern human foragers as well. There's about half adults, half children. So there's 13 individuals, of whom 7 are adults, 3 are adolescents, 2 are juveniles, and 1 is an infant. And there's 3 maternal lineages. In the mitochondrial DNA of the bones, there's 3 maternal lineages because they're inherited through the mother, and 3 adult males all have the same mother. So people have argued that this supports Neanderthal males holding a territory and females coming in. There is a problem with that. and that is that we don't have Alistair hasn't done his work on the teeth for strontium, so we can't actually tell whether all of them grew up in that area or whether all of them moved as a group into that area. Genetic evidence will give you who's related to whom, but it won't necessarily tell you where they came from. There's quite a variety of different statures as well in these Neanderthals from L-Cedron. All the red ones, SDRs, some of them very small, are adult Neanderthals. So again, a warning that we should not generalize for Neanderthals. And in fact, one of the adolescents on L-Cedron is taller than many of the adults. So, there's variation. Somebody did try to do something like Alistair's work, but you can see here it's not laser ablation, it's just a couple of drilled trenches in the tooth enamel. And that evidence seemed to suggest that this adolescent did not grow up in the area of L-Cedron, they'd come from somewhere else. So it does sort of imply that the whole group moved into the area. Maybe the local group took exception to their presence and got rid of them. Alistair says he needs to do the work. He doesn't trust that work, so leave that hanging. Now, I touched earlier on gossip and things like that. That sort of implies the ability to speak. This is a hyoid bone. This is what sits in your throat, Adam's apple. And Neanderthals one look exactly the same as a modern human. So the argument goes that Neanderthals could speak like us. And the subsequent work has suggested, in the middle, the grey box and whisker in the middle, Neanderthals one, Neanderthals overlap with us in the ability to hear certain sounds and frequencies. Certainly much more aligned with us than the early pre-Neanderthals, which are the red at the bottom, Simudlos Huesos. So Neanderthals probably had similar abilities to speak and to hear conversations as we do. And that, I think, is important for later points. We certainly know that Neanderthals could look after each other. This individual in the middle, Shanidar 1, had a partial right arm, stops about here, so somebody must have looked after him. The individual on the right lost most of his molars, so somebody must have helped feed him, and then when he died, somebody buried him. So social care is certainly present in Neanderthals. The question is who's doing it? Is it the immediate family looking after them, or is it a wider network? I suspect it's the immediate family. Of course, we also have to contend with the evidence for interbreeding, which has become increasingly common. Every week you open a newspaper or a website and there's another specimen to have to fit into the puzzle. I'm only including a few of them here, mostly from Eastern Europe. So there's sites like Peștera Curioase in Romania, which is one of the first to be discovered in Europe, and beneath it, Batchokiro, which is now the oldest modern human with Neanderthal DNA in it. And the first one of these to be really identified was Ustishim in Siberia. All of these suggest that at some point, sometimes quite a long time ago, but sometimes only 3 or 4 generations earlier, there was Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. And recent papers come out saying, oh, this period in interbreeding lasts 12,000 years and it begins here and it ends there. I suspect that as long as there are modern humans in an area and as long as there are Neanderthals in an area, there's the potential for interbreeding. I think it's important not just for gaining local knowledge. Neanderthals will know exactly what the environment's like. If you're moving in as a modern human, you can plug into that knowledge by joining the group. I think the frequency of it happening is suggesting that this is not just isolated in evidence. Pretty much every human remains now we find at this period seems to have some Neanderthal DNA in it. So I suspect this is a process. It's not a series of events. And it might be very different at the beginning when modern humans are coming into a landscape with majority Neanderthal, they're joining Neanderthal groups, as opposed to the end when Neanderthals are probably outnumbered by modern humans. There's going to be a shift in that social balance and local knowledge and so on from one end of the interbreeding period to the other, and I don't think anyone's really thought about that yet. The individual on the right-hand side is Denisova Cave, which is famous, of course, for the Denisovans, but not only were Neanderthals at this cave interbreeding with Denisovans, but they were also show evidence of interbreeding with modern humans, probably about 40,000 years earlier, so maybe about 100,000 years ago. And we have a little cluster of sites at Kafse, for example, and School, which isn't on that map, but it should be, where Neanderthals and modern humans seem to coexist in the same area at about that time. So maybe this is evidence of movement farther to the east after that interbreeding 40,000 years earlier. So this is a complex history, and the more samples we get, the more complex and confusing it gets. Now there are raw material quirks in Europe that we need to take into account. We always talk about modern humans moving longer distances to get raw materials. That's partly because of the nature of the raw materials they're after and where they're getting them from. So in Western Europe, southwestern France there, the distances are relatively small because the patches of raw material are actually quite close together. So flint nodules and so on are quite easy to come by. In Central Europe, because of the complex geology of it, it's much harder to find raw material sources in certain areas. So that explains why you're having to go much farther to get those raw materials. Now, most raw materials are within 5 kilometers radius of a site. More materials that come from over 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers in modern humans, but Neanderthals are also doing it. And that's probably because the Neanderthals living in Central Europe have to behave like that. They have to go long distance to get those raw materials. And having got those raw materials, they can turn them to a variety of forms. If we were to show this to an undergraduate class 30 years ago, they'd say, oh, that's modern humans making those tools, because that at the time was what we thought modern humans did. These are Neanderthal sites from Germany around 100,000 years ago. So long before modern humans come in, Neanderthals are independently inventing the same sort of technology. Again, down here on the right, on the Neronian, which is this one of the sites in the southern Rhone basin, we have these tiny little tools. They're about that big, and they're tiny little points. And it's as if, everything becomes tiny, suddenly becomes tiny, and then after 1,000 years or so, it disappears and is replaced by big chunky tools again. Now, this could, until a couple of years ago, been interpreted as Neanderthals being replaced by another group of Neanderthals. It would certainly fit with the genetic turnover at about that time. Recent papers suggested this is modern humans based on one tooth. So I don't know whether to believe it or not, really. If it's true, Neanderthals are suddenly replaced by modern humans very, very briefly at 54,000 years ago, and then the modern humans disappear and Neanderthals come back. I don't know. I think we need more samples, we need more sites before we can clearly argue that there's a modern human incursion at this point, and what might have driven it. This is a fairly typical Neanderthal tool. This is very well preserved, though. So looking at these microscopically under the microscope, you can actually see tiny remnants of the roots, the rhizomes of a reed. So this tool was used to scrape and pulverize underground storage organs of a reed, an aquatic plant. We also have little twists of plant fibers. So they're extracting plant fibers from something and then they're twisting them. These are not just accidentally from cutting, these are actually fragments of twisted cord. We also have at the site, because the preservation is so good, again this is the Southern Rhone, we have little fragments of feather barbule and fish scales and rabbit hair, which nicely match the cut-marked rabbit bones. So at ideal sites, we can get this sort of information, and this also gives us a seasonality indicator. When are they collecting these these resources? When are they available? And another tool found from the same site more recently, we have a slightly more convincing twist of cord, which was found adhering to the waterlogged side of a flint tool. And you can see it's a triple ply of vegetable cord that just survives in a tiny little area inside that red square. So they're twisting these things. What are they twisting them for? Do they want cords for something? Do they want nets to catch fish with? Do they want cords maybe to catch rabbits, snares? And that immediately opens up a whole set of technology that we barely know anything about. What are they using it for? This is a distribution of these sorts of tools and their surviving remnants, like feathers and scales on them, and it shifts from an earlier level, slightly farther to the left, as if they're moving, doing stuff around a half, and the halves have shifted, and over time the distribution has changed. And that spatial organization is important because it can give us an indication of how space is being used. Where do individuals sleep, for example? Well, according to excavators at this site, the Abrique Romani, it's in this little area here with hearths, or half swept out hearths, and they think this little corner of the site could have housed between 4 and 6 individuals, if each had about 2 meters square to themselves. So where people do things in a site is an important thing to bear in mind. And there's not many sites you can do it. Most of the time, Neanderthals are spending so long in a site that all their occupation debris gets swept away. They clean it out and push it to the margins of the site, and that doesn't help us as archaeologists. It's nice, one thing to be cave proud, but to sweep everything away. So only a few sites have this sort of evidence. And one site is Tor Faraj in Jordan, where 2 layers, about 20,000 years apart, basically seem to use the site in very much the same way. There's different plant phytoliths from different parts of plants and different plant species scattered throughout the site. And you don't need to look too much at the left, but I just advise you to move your eye over to the right and the interpretation. This is a rock shelter, so it has a wide open mouth, and across that wide open mouth they scattered, or they arranged, thorny brush, which would keep out predators while they were sleeping. And on either side, the entrance and the exit, as it were, on either side of that brush windbreak, were 2 large hearths. So if you keep that burning, you've basically sort of fenced yourself in. And right at the back, these orange areas are the claimed bedding areas. Rather like with Abrique Romani, you sleep at the back of the cave, or the rock shelter in this case. So if you look at each one of those, there's up to 11 people there. It's almost the level, the number of individuals that we see at El Cedron, that death assemblage of individuals. So maybe this is a sort of fairly typical Neanderthal group size, somewhere between around a dozen individuals, which seems quite small. Now, Neanderthals are doing other things. They're not just living, they're also creating weird things for us to puzzle over. So this hit the news a little while ago, 2018 now. The left-hand illustration is a single vertical line, and on that vertical line are tiny little concretions of calcite. And those were dated by Alistair again, my colleague, and came up with a minimum age. In other words, the calcite overlay this red ochre line, and the calcite gave a minimum age for that red line of around 65,000 years ago, long before modern humans get to Iberia. Other examples are Neanderthals smearing red pigments on stalactites. This is at the site of Ardalis. Even up there, you have to use D-stretch to be able to see it clearly, is a hand stencil. Somebody put their hand on the rock face and blew pigment around it and left a hand outline on the rock surface. You can't do that on your own. You need somebody to hold a light to help you. You need somebody to hold the pigment to help you. So at least 2 people were involved with that simple hand stencil. So it implies that there's cooperation going on. The question is it the whole group of 12 participating, or is it just a few individuals doing something deep in the cave? Same for this weird construction, which is a series of concentric structures, all based on smashed up stalagmites, which are sort of laid a bit like bricks or sticks in circles, and then they burnt material on top of these walls of stalagmites. And they did this 176,000 years ago. So this is long before this painting the walls of caves in the same sort of area in western parts of Europe. It's something that probably happens, and whether this is I'll talk about this right at the end, this is a sort of cosmology for Neanderthals, the down below, the surface, and as we'll come to speak in a minute, the air. Now, at the moment, it's hard to identify what Neanderthals are doing what. When we look at injuries on them, males and females seem to have a fairly energetic, rough and tumble lifestyle. So it implies that the women aren't staying around the hearth looking after children and processing food. They're getting out there as well and doing quite a lot of hunting. Then the question is, how does childcare fit into that? Do they have creches of other children who look after them? That seems to be what happens in modern hunter-gatherers. So maybe something similar is happening here. We have some examples. This site was originally thought to be 40, 50,000 years old, and it got redated, and it's now 120,000. Some marine shells, which have been perforated for suspension, and on the inside of one or two of them, there's some red ochre smeared on the inside. So is this a sort of Neanderthal symbolic object to say where you come from, or who you've got connections to? I've got friends at the coast. This is an increasingly interesting symbolic behaviour that we're seeing for Neanderthals, and it seems to be quite geographically restricted to this sort of area. If you were to exclude the southern one, because that's quite a late one, it would be even more constricted. And this is the use of raptors, things like eagles, falcons, owls even, as adornment. They're not just they don't seem to be eating these animals. They seem to be taking the feathers from them, and they seem to be taking the talons from them and adapting them so they can be worn, they can be suspended. And it occurs from at least 120,000. That 120,000 is the site farthest to the east. And it's most common between about 60 and 40,000 years ago. Why are they doing this? Is this the sky? Is this, are these birds symbolic in some way? Maybe it's because they can tell you where your food is. If you're looking for scavengers in the sky, you look for vultures and eagles and where they're moving to. So maybe we've done the below, we've done the surface. This is the third tier of a Neanderthal cosmology. Now, I was skeptical about the little tiny spear points being a modern human, but if they are, it would imply that modern humans are also using these birds of prey in this area. Maybe they're influenced by Neanderthals, or maybe it's Neanderthals carrying on doing it. At the moment, unclear. So this is one on the left, the largest one in fact, Amondra E, is the one that might be modern human copying or trying to get into the Neanderthal social networks, or it might just be a Neanderthal carry on doing it. So it's a bit unfocused, unfortunately, but there's an awful lot of different avenues we can pursue. I think I would like to summarize them all as a set of needs further research questions, really, and themes. So I think we need to explore much more how Neanderthal society operated in terms of individual interactions and division of labour. As I said earlier, if we got an interbreeding event, a serious process, then is the earlier interbreeding much more, Neanderthal dominated, and is the later one more modern human dominated? We need to think through the social implications of that as the balance of society shifts. Seasonality is something we need to look at in much more detail for the whole of the Neanderthals' occupation for, 300,000 years or more. I'd also like to see something that explored the energetic costs of Neanderthal daily life, taking into account the variety of body forms we know Neanderthals had. They're not all short and stocky. They're not all, like weightlifters as well. They probably had seasons where they put on weight to get them through the winter, and then in the summer they got a lot leaner. How do we quantify those energetic landscapes, things like terrain and slope and climatic conditions? We need to do that for Neanderthals and work out really what the baseline costs and benefits are for them to collect their resources. And finally, wouldn't it be nice to find evidence for longer distance symbolic interactions, not just smears on cave walls or maybe the odd trinket from the beach, but something that's moved a really long way. And that will give us some sense of interactions, but also storage and meaning being incorporated and embedded into objects. So, early days, but thank you for your attention.